Do you view Judaism as a religion? I've heard you say in some videos that it isn't. How do you view Judaism?
Jews are essentially a people, but like any people, a people has a territory, its own culture, its own laws, and so on. But the Jewish people were expelled from our land. Any people that goes through this kind of thing ends up assimilating, ends up fading away in history. This didn't happen to the Jewish people. We continued with the aspiration to return to our land. And what we developed, let's say, to hold on to that historical memory we had, became what was called Judaism. It's like this suitcase of concepts, ideas, traditions, approaches, whether political, economic, national, cultural, or dietary. All aspects of Jewish life were gathered in this suitcase that accompanied us in exile. And that's what they call Judaism. It's actually a Greek term. The first time it appears is in 2nd Maccabees, which is a Jewish apocryphal book. And it isn't until the 17th century that it takes on a religious connotation. In the 17th century, the encyclopedists tried to categorize the Jew as, it was a time when they were trying to. It's one of the diseases that modernity brought us, that they think they can explain the world. It's academia. Yes, all of this. They think they can explain the world through schemes, sociology, psychology. Let's explain the human soul. Let's explain how we classify human groups. And we can't call this human group called Jews a nation because they don't have territory. Let's call it a religion because they have a tradition that they brought from their nation a long time ago. And since they don't have territory, we have to put them in the encyclopedic category that fits, which is called religion, which doesn't make sense. There are atheist Jews. The system called Judaism. How can someone be an atheist without religion? An atheist as part of a religion? It's very strange, isn't it? It doesn't make sense. But Judaism is we are not a religion. Judaism is the collection of Jewish ideas. And nowadays, since the Jewish people have returned to our land, this definition is starting to regain its old meaning. Yes, the old definition is once again, let's say, returning to its original essence. I don't know if the audience knows a little about what is being discussed. Albert Einstein won the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect. A Jew, by the way, who has to explain that the electron is also an atom. Sorry, it's part of an atom. It is also a particle, but it is also a wave. But how is that possible? It's either a particle or a wave. Actually, it's both, but we tend to say it's one or the other, even though it's both at once. Millennia ago, peoples and nations didn't have religion. Religion or spirituality was just part of their system. But it wasn't a category on its own, like the category we call politics, or the category of economy, or the category of religion. It wasn't like that before, but that's how the Westerners made us believe it was.
Yes, that's actually a really interesting answer because that's exactly it, right? Before, sciences as such, even Christian sciences, were strongly connected with religion itself, and it wasn't called religion, but rather it was called natural theology within philosophy, natural philosophy, not within philosophy. So, it's strange. So let me ask you this. If the Jewish people have always seen themselves as a civilization, in this case, right? A worldview. Do you think that precisely the Zionist ideologues, let's say like Theodor Herzl or others, with this idea that the Jewish people, being an ethnicity, need their own nation, need their own territory, do you think these people might have been influenced by Kant? Since Kant is one of the great philosophers, right, of modernism, of idealism, and precisely from the Prussian Empire, right? He basically wrote a book called Treatise on Perpetual Peace. And in that book, he presents this political idea where a people with a different language, a distinct ethnicity, and a different worldview have precisely the right to that territory. Do you think that in that sense, Zionism was also born along with modernism, or even before that? Since, let's say, because it's a bit complicated to weave this together, since, as you know, in the time when, for example, God gave the land to Moses, there was no national sovereignty nor international recognition, you know? And so that made the Jewish people get involved in many wars, right? Like with the peoples of the Levant, isn't that true? So it's difficult because, let's say, even though people do have the right today, in the present, to be internationally recognized and to have that sovereignty, how do you reconcile that, right? How can you prove that Zionism didn't actually originate, as you say, with modernism? And that way of seeing the Jew as an ethnicity makes thinkers adopt these changed ideas and not the other way around. That precisely, by being a people, since God gave them that land, then they have to raise their voice to simply gain that international recognition. I don't know if I explained myself well enough.
I think you did. I think the idea of Jewish nationalism is very old. That is, throughout the end of the Tanakh, we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, we're talking about Jews who aspire to liberate their nation. They even rebel against Babylon. We see it in the first century in texts. Even the Christian text talks about Judas the Galilean. We have the Bar Kokhba revolt, another Jewish attempt to regain independence from Rome. And throughout history, there were always attempts. During the Byzantine Empire, there were attempts. During the empire after the Persians, because the Persians returned at that time. There were also attempts with Marzutra, with Yosef Nasi in the Middle Ages. In the 15th and 14th centuries, there were attempts. And I think the best gift Europe gave us was Zionism. Once again, Jewish nationalism centered on this territory has always existed. Anyone who picks up any Jewish book, whatever it may be, most of our texts talk about the land of Israel. Most of our texts and sources discuss returning to the land and how things are done there. This aspiration has always existed. But as a political model in the sense of a state, that is something from modern times, because it was in the time of Theodor Herzl when nationalisms began to emerge. Not necessarily driven by Kant, but because that was the climate. Those nationalisms had arisen out of the romantic atmosphere of the time. That the ethnic groups, as you call them, were being reborn. And if the Jews, as Theodor Herzl conceived it, are a nation, then we must return to our land, to our country. Even just to have a country. There were those who suggested, okay, not even that we return to Israel, but that we at least have a country. Yes, obviously, those were ideas like having a country on a continent or in, I don't know, in Patagonia, but those were not the most significant ideas. Ultimately, the Jews chose to return to the land of Israel. So, in that sense, and you mentioned something very interesting, a term, which is that we Jews are a civilization. The question of what we Jews are is very difficult. I've often wondered about it. I say we're a people, though that's a simplification. I have asked great scholars this question, and several have told me what you said, a civilization. I think it's a very, very good definition, but it feels strange to me to say civilization. But anyway, in any case, I would basically say that Jewish nationalism has always existed, but Zionism was the modern tool that made it possible to create a state. Because in modern times, as you say, things are discussed in other terms, in terms of international law, the United Nations, and other kinds of things. It's not like it was in the past, right? That's why there was a precursor to this in political theory, but in political theory, modernism does have an influence, obviously.
Interesting.